communities. So we are just delighted to host this presentation as a result of that. In looking, I found a quote from Sidney Lanier that I think seems to summarize the value of this event. And it says, "The greatest work has always gone hand in hand with the most fervent moral purpose." So we hope you are enlightened through this presentation. We thank you for coming. We thank you for your continued support of the library, and may God bless you. Bless you.
Shall we pray? God our Father, our help in ages past and hope for years to come. Father, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for giving us this day. This is the day you have made, and we shall continuously rejoice and be glad in it. Thank you tonight, Father, what's taking place, that we will share in Winter Park's history, and we know it is history because it is your story. It is how you have guided people, how you have directed their lives, and how you have satisfied them with favor. And Lord, for what we hear tonight, let us be encouraged to know that failure is not an option when you have favored us with your presence. Bless Dr. McCloud tonight as she speaks and make her presentation. Bless our hearts and our ears as we hear to receive what has been shared. In Jesus' name we pray. We all say together, amen.
And I am the coordinator of the Lifelong Learning Institute at the Winter Park Public Library. So I want to welcome you again on behalf of the Institute and know that this is an exciting venture for us this evening. The Smith Grant is the result of a bequest by Ray Marsh Smith and his wife Dorothy Lockhart Smith. And the grant is administered by the Olin Library at Rollins College and the Winter Park Public Library. It is an annual grant that is given to someone specifically to do research on the history of Winter Park. And that is where Dr. McCloud comes in. She was this year's grant recipient, and we think we've done a wonderful job in terms of looking at the history of Winter Park's Black churches. And we are waiting with bated breath to hear what she has to say. I also want to introduce the Grant Selection Committee. It's made up of individuals from Rollins College's library as well as the Winter Park Public Library. And I will start from my left. Dr. Thad Seymour, would you wave or stand, whichever's easiest. Bob Melanson is, right there's him, this one up. He's the director of the Winter Park Public Library. Dorothy May, right here from Rollins Library. Wen-Chin Chang is the archivist at the Rollins Library. Dean Paget is the History and Archives individual at the Winter Park Public Library. And I think we're missing one committee member who had a death in the family this evening, so I'll have to in prayer with Donna Cohen as she deals with that situation. I also want to acknowledge the president of the board of the Winter Park Public Library Board of Trustees. That is Dr. Ruth Prather, also provost at Valencia Community College Winter Park campus. I think I got everybody. If I left anybody out, chalk it up to my mistake. But without any further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Rebekah McCloud, who is Associate Director of the Office of Diversity Initiatives at the University of Central Florida, and this year's recipient of the Ray Marsh Smith and Dorothy Lockhart Smith Research Grant. Dr. McCloud.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's wonderful to be here tonight. This is a project that I tell people all the time that God laid this on my heart. I go to church here in Winter Park, and as I come through every Sunday, I see all the changes that are going on, and I wonder to myself, who's collecting the history and what's happening to the voices of the people who are here? And you know, this grant was something that I didn't know anything about until I just kind of stumbled upon it. And actually, God put it in my path. You know, I didn't stumble upon it. There wasn't a chance. God put it in my path. So it's ongoing. This is just the beginning of what this will eventually be. What I started off doing is looking at the historic Black churches in Winter Park, and there are about 9 of the churches. 6 participated in this part of the project, And now I have some of the others who have decided that they would like to participate too. So it's going to be an ongoing project. Hopefully it's earned doctors. Okay. What I'll go through in this PowerPoint presentation, I'll go through a little bit of stuff with you about Winter Park. And probably I'm going to stand anyway, so I'm going to get over here. Can y'all still hear me? Yes. Okay. I don't need the mic, unless you need it for taping. Do you need the mic for taping? You do need it. Okay. I have a booming voice. I used to be a teacher. And so for many years, I was a teacher. Winter Park, for those of you who probably all of you know about Winter Park, in 1881, Warren Chase and Oliver Chapman bought 600 acres of land. 38 parcels were designated as in for Negro, and that was the beginning of Hannibal Square, where we are right now. Those Negroes, as they were called during that time in 1881, were people who would work for the white residents of Winter Park. And the land, and when the initial, if you look at the old documents from the beginnings of Winter Park, it states that the land could be used to build houses, churches, and a school. And so that's what happened in Hannibal Square. Hannibal Square was named by Warren Chase. And there's lots of Winter Park lore about who named it, why it was named. But Hannibal Square was named after the great African general who in 202 BC he and his troops defeated the Romans. And so Warren Chase, when he decided to name it, he thought that would be a really great name for this area of Winter Park. The interesting thing that I found in the research is that Hannibal Square is actually one of the oldest black settlements in the United States. Now, Eatonville says that they are the oldest incorporated municipality, and that's true. But Hannibal Square was organized in 1881, about 7 years before Eatonville. And the reason it doesn't get that designation is that it was never incorporated as an individual entity. Although it was de-annexed in 1893, and still it didn't register itself as an individual municipality, and then it was in 1925 annexed again in the city. The interesting thing about it is that Hannibal Square had a larger population than Winter Park proper, and there was this huge election where the black residents of Hannibal Square outvoted the white residents, so the white residents said, we can't have this, so they de-annexed Hannibal Square out of the city. The oldest black church in Winter Park was founded in 1886. 3 of the churches in Winter Park came from one of the churches, and one of the pastored 2 of the churches, which I found interesting because as I went through, I kept seeing that face over and over again. And then one man provided seed money that built 5 of the churches, including the one that you're sitting in. The one guy, Reverend C.J. Smith. Now, in some places he's called Charles Johnson Smith, and some places he's called Captain John Smith. So it's really interesting. I kept seeing that Charles Johnson. And then his daughter, Altamese Smith Bentley, who lives in Sanford, who's a historian, said his real name was Captain John. But he didn't like the Captain John, so he changed it to Charles Johnson. Well, Reverend Smith was a Florida native. He came from a little place up in Jackson County. The interesting thing about him is that when he became a minister, that he was a prolific church pastor and organizer. He organized one church, which was Bethel, where you are sitting now. He built 3 churches. Bethel was one of those 3, and he pastored 9 churches, all in Central Florida. I think the furthest out he went was Winter Haven. And actually, there's a church that he built that's still in Sanford. And actually, Corinth is in Longwood, which I think is now Mount Olive. They changed the name to Mount Olive. The second man who provided the seed money was William Corson. Now, he was an attorney from New York who was born in Staten Island, and he purchased a home in Winter Park in 1915. When he died in 1934, his estate was worth about $200,000, and that was like, big bucks in 1934. The interesting part about him is that he left money to all of the churches in Winter Park, and that included all the black churches in Winter Park. He also left money to the Winter Park Public Library, the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army. But now, it's interesting. All the places I looked, people generally agree that it was about $10,000 that all the churches got in 1935. And again, at 35, that was a whole lot of money, a whole lot of money for these churches. And I think a lot of folks were really impressed with Mr. Corson because the black churches got the money as well as the white churches. And they had lots of respect for him. And he was a noted philanthropist. This is a newspaper advertisement for the auction. Everything was auctioned. His house, he lived over in Interlochen, his house and all the contents were auctioned off. And then that's how the money then was divided up amongst the churches and the library. Okay. As I went through this study, there are Baptist churches, one Methodist church, and then there are Pentecostal churches in the study. So I kind of grouped them together by their congregation. When I went through when I met with the committee, one of the things a couple of committee members said was, we'd like to know more about the congregations. How did these denominations get started? That may be something interesting to do. And it was very interesting for me to do this because, I'm the daughter of a Baptist minister. And, I grew up going to Baptist church. You go in there, every time the door is open, you're there. And my mom's out here in the audience, and I'm raising your hand. My mom was the perfect pastor's wife. And so I knew absolutely nothing about the Baptist church other than my father pastored churches for about 50 years. And so as I started doing this research, I learned so much about Baptists. And then, of course, I learned a whole lot about the Methodists and about the Pentecostal as well. So it's interesting, whenever I started talking about this, I had people who argued with me, and I said, look, I know this stuff. Okay, so now the majority of black churches in America are Baptists. And, there's so many jokes about Baptist church. And there's one that was going around, if you say amen and you talk back to the future, you must be a Baptist, which is true. You must be a Baptist. The Baptists, interestingly enough, were the first denomination to build black churches in America. The oldest Baptist church was the first African Baptist church, and it was on the Williamsburg Plantation in Virginia. It was built between 1773 and 1775. 10 black Baptist communities exist in the United States, and in 1997, there were about 11 million black Baptists. So now in 2004, you can estimate maybe 3-4 more million have been added to the rolls. But that is, interesting. In Winter Park, the 3 black Baptist churches that are part of this study are Mount Moriah, which is down the road. You go back up to Pennsylvania and turn left. Bethel, where you are, and then New Hope, which is down on Haven. Okay, Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the oldest black Baptist church in Winter Park. It was built in 1886, it was organized in 1886 in the home of Charles and Missouri Ambrose. And I think the interesting thing about all of the churches is they all started in somebody's home. And I think now the whole black church movement is going back to, now they call them cell churches, and then it was just called church, now they're cells. And so it's interesting how it's evolved back again that people are starting at homes. So all these churches started with 1 or 2 people in somebody's home. And when it started, growing, and when it had enough members, about 25 or so, they had a pastor. And that first pastor in 1887 was Reverend C.J. Smith. And he came to pastor Mount Moriah. After he came, they purchased some property, 2 lots they still own on the corners of Lyman and Pennsylvania Avenue for $55. And so, wow, now we say, wow, but $55 was a lot of money. So these people saved, when I was really struck by that $55 that these people saved for years, pennies and, quarters and dimes, and sold cakes and pies, all you black folks, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? All those fish sandwiches, to save up $55 to build their first church. So this was, monumental for them to save that $55. All throughout this presentation, I have pictures that I've taken inside and outside of the church, and I'll talk you through some of these. This chair is one of the chairs in the pulpit where the pastor and his guests sit, and these are all hand carved because some of these date back to the 1800s and the early 1900s, and so they were before they were machine made chairs and things, and some of them have been refurbished. They put new upholstery in the chairs, but they kept the bones of them. When Mount Moriah grew, the congregation grew too big, they met for a time in the town hall, but they met every other Sunday because during that time, and actually when I first came to Florida like 25 years ago, as a child, of course, I was only 2. Churches still met every other Sunday, and that was because one pastor would maybe pastor 2 or 3 churches. And so he would go one Sunday to Bethel, another Sunday to another church. So they met every other Sunday. In 1935, with the money from William Corson, Mount Moriah built the second, but the first real church, which is still standing if you go down to Pennsylvania Avenue. And they spent $8,500 of their $10,000 to build their church. And then they spent the rest of the money buying some more property. In 1946, they built a parsonage because they realized that they didn't want this itinerant pastor. They wanted to have a place for their pastor, so they built a home for their pastor there at the church. In 1959, they built the annex and then a new parsonage, which still existed right next door to the church. In 1970, they went through some major renovations. The picture that you see here is a picture of the current sanctuary. It's beautiful inside. If you haven't had a chance, I hope that you all will, if you haven't visited these churches, that you'll take an opportunity to go by and go into the churches. Mount Moriah celebrated their 100th anniversary in 1986. I love this picture of their marquee outside with the plants all around. It's beautiful. The stained glass windows, it's interesting that Mount Moriah is the only black church in Winter Park that have stained glass windows. Some of the others had stained glass windows, but as they got cracked and old, they were taken out. But Mount Moriah, actually in the 70s, replaced their windows. And the new windows they have, I think it was like 1979, they replaced the windows. And there are 10 of them, and they have this huge rose window. But the 10 stained glass windows each depict a different event in the life of Christ. And if for nothing else, please go and see the stained glass windows at Mount Moriah. The second one is Bethel, where you are. Bethel was organized in 1911, and it was an outgrowth of Mount Moriah. And I told you that one pastor created 3 churches came out of one, and one pastor 2, and that was Reverend Smith. He was the first pastor of Bethel. He started his own congregation, because remember, he went to Mount Moriah when it was started, and he came down after a couple of years and started Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. He founded it with 10 families, so the Reverend Smith and then 10 families who started this church, about 20 people. The first sanctuary was on Welborn. We're on Welborn, but it was the other way when they built that first sanctuary. In 1926, they acquired the parsonage, and of course it's next door, and an adjacent lot for $1. And it was quick deeded from one of the Charles Morse. Actually, after he died, that parsonage and the land were given to the church for $1, which was good. You know, they got that first little property. In 1936, Bethel built their money, again from the money that was given to them from William Corson. They built their church where you are sitting right now. They built this edifice. And the name was changed to Bethel Progressive Baptist Church. And it was so because one of the members thought that Bethel was so progressive with all the things that had happened in Bethel that they should really insert that in the name. So it became Bethel Progressive Baptist Church. Now, the lights are off so you can't see this. When I first came into this church, I was really struck by those beautiful blue chairs. And this piano, which is in the annex, and you'll get to see this piano. But these chairs are part of the choir loft up behind us. And these chairs are from 1936, so they're original to the church. The interesting thing about the choirs in 1919, choir number 1 was started. Now, choir number 1 was made history because it was the first colored, okay, we progressed Negro to colored. It was the first colored group to perform on Winter Park's WDBO radio. And after they performed on the radio, they went a couple of years doing concerts around the area. So they made history. As did the Boyer Brothers, for those of you who are gospel music buffs. This picture was taken right in the back here. You can still see the railing there. The youth group in about 1930. When they turn the lights off, you can see these light fixtures there. I can point them out to you. All on the side of the walls here, and they're up in the balconies. And these are from 1936. And so they're here. It is reminders of days gone by. Actually, the bell is still up in the bell tower, which I think is interesting. I'm not going to go up and ring it, but you got to climb the stairs first, you know. Bethel was renamed in 1945 to Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, and the dining room, the annex, was constructed in 1957. And it was Dr. Reverend Hendricks, who was the pastor, and they thought it was very progressive because Reverend Hendricks actually started a lot of the auxiliaries and programs here at Bethel, and the annex is named in his honor. He led the renovations. He purchased property on New England, Lyman, Wellborn, and Virginia Avenues. So he was really one of the instrumental ministers in Bethel's history, up until Reverend Young, of course. The Third Baptist Church is New Hope. Now, New Hope Baptist Church, and this picture I took a couple of months ago, and I was there yesterday, and it doesn't look like this anymore. So I thought, okay, I didn't have time to scan that picture today because I had back-to-back meetings to put it in there. But New Hope was built in 1929, and it was the third church that came out of Mount Moriah. So the three Baptist churches, Mount Moriah, Bethel, and New Hope, all came from Mount Moriah. It was, again, outgrowth of Mount Moriah. It was built in 1935, again, from the money from William Corson. The interesting thing, I think, about New Bethel is that it was the fastest growing church in Winter Park. At one point, it had over 400 members, which was a big church for 1935. Okay, and of course now, for the standards now, it's a big church. As I was going through looking, doing some research, I ran across a study that Harvard had done about black church, actually about church attendance in general. And what it said was that the average American church has about 50 active members. And, you know, which I thought was interesting because it started off saying that when people think of churches, they think of high steeple mega churches, which is only about 2% of all of the churches in the United States. So a church of 50 is pretty average. So in 1935, you know, 400 people in the church, you know, that was a mega church. You know, that was like First Baptist, you know, it was a mega church. And especially 400 black people in Winter Park in a church was like, woo, you know. The church was, because it grew so much, in 1953, they rebuilt the church and they doubled the size of the church. It's interesting when you go into the church, there's a big pole right down the middle of the church. And so I asked Reverend Phillips, who's the pastor, well, why is this pole here? Why didn't you all take this out when you were building? And he said, no, we left it because the church was actually, the one side on the right was the old church, and then over on the left is a new church. And so we left that so we would have, you know, this reminder of our growth. So it was interesting. When they rebuilt the church in 1953, they completely remodeled the outside. I mean, dramatically changed the outside because they wanted to reflect the architecture of the time. So it looks very different from all of the other churches in Winter Park. These pews are the floors, which is interesting. It's pretty austere inside. When you go in, there are no padded pews. So you go in and, you know, if the service goes a little long, you know, you got to wiggle around in those seats, you know. And the floors are bare. Now, the interesting thing I have to tell you about the bare floors. is, now Bethel doesn't have the underneath the pews is not there, but most of the other churches do. And I was talking with Reverend Dr. Parker, who's the pastor of Ward Chapel, and I said, why is it, there underneath? And he said, that's so when people get happy, they can stomp their feet. He said, and actually he said, you pat your foot. And I said, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? You get real happy, it get good to you. You pat your foot, and it gets really good to you, you stomp your feet. And that's a way of communicating with the minister that you hear, that you understand and it's good to you. So, I thought that was really interesting that in most of the churches they have that bareness up there. And I think that's the place you need to have the cushion, so you don't hear all those things. He said, oh no, they communicate with me. I hear that foot stomping and I know I'm doing a good job. But when you go into New Hope, you'll see that the pews are there. These are the pews from 1935 and the same floors and everything. It's interesting in the church that over in the amen corner, okay? Like in this church, you have the amen corner where the old lady sit. Well, you have actually, the deacons are on this side. And then, Baptist church are all the same. Deacons are over here and mothers over on this side. Well, over where the deacons are, it kind of slants down a little bit. And I said, you must have a lot of men in that church, which is good, it's good because it's leaning over a little bit. So it's interesting inside. And I hope you'll get a chance to go inside that church as well. I think the thing that struck me most about New Hope was they went from 400 members and now they have less than 50 members. And so the church has started to die out. And I hope that the church remains. I wouldn't want to see it close. But church membership is on a decline, not just black churches, but all over the United States. People are not going to church as much as they used to. And so the membership kind of waxes and wanes. And so the pastor there, Reverend Phillips, is trying to kind of revitalize the church. As I said, I was there yesterday, and so they'd done some work outside, and so I thought that was really encouraging. And they had a pretty nice congregation yesterday, that it was encouraging that the church is going to at least bounce back. They're really going through a restoration. But this church is debt-free and land-rich. Although they have less than 50 members, they own about 6 lots. Which makes them very appealing to developers. And Reverend Phillips has told me that developers have been by a number of times asking about their land, especially because the church on the outside looked like it was on the decline. And but he said they will not sell because they're debt free, and so they can afford to sustain themselves. They said, I just pay light bill, keep going, And he said, if I'm here by myself, I'll turn those pews. I do like Jesus. I'll turn those pews into souls, So I said, okay, Reverend, don't give up. Keep going. There's only one Black Methodist church that's in this study here. There were actually 2. And Grand Chapel was closed. And that's Ward Chapel. Now, the interesting thing about the Methodists is there are 3 groups of Methodists. There are AME, the African Methodist Episcopal, and the AME Zion, and then the CME. Now, the CME, when they started, were called the Colored Methodist Episcopal, and now they're the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. They started in 1787, and Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and several others were praying in a church in Philadelphia, and they were actually pulled out of their seats and they were taken out of the church because they were sitting praying in an area of the church that they didn't realize was a white area. And so some of the white parishioners were like, no, y'all can't come in here and just kind of toss it out in the street. They were so outraged by that they went off and banded together and they started what they call the Free African Society. And the Free African Society met and they had some church services, and eventually they started their first church, which was Bethel, and it was Bethel Church. And Methodists called it Mother Bethel. So you had Mother Bethel Church, which was started in 1794, and then in 1816 the AME denomination officially started. They had their official charter. Then the first, and this was in Philadelphia, so most of the AME churches and most of the Methodist churches were in the north. The first southern one was in Charleston in 1865. The interesting thing is that the Methodists have only about 4 or 5 million of all three of those denominations, Black Methodists in the United States. Word Chapel was organized in 1893 by Reverend T.M.D. Ward. And I looked through the history. It was initially called a mission because they didn't have enough members to become a church. So they were a mission until they were officially named and they got enough members. Excuse me. Their first sanctuary was on Pennsylvania Avenue, and that was in 1893. One of the other things I think is interesting, of course, I thought a lot of stuff was interesting in researching this, was that Reverend Quarterman was the only Black pastor mentioned anywhere in any of the documents of Winter Park. I went through all the books about Winter Park. I read every single page of the Chase papers, which are tons of pages. I knew Dean got tired of seeing me in the library, and over at Rollins, Trudy helped me pull out some stuff. But I went through every single page, and he was the only Black pastor mentioned in any of those papers. And there were very few mentions of any Black people in Winter Park. Gus Henderson was mentioned a couple of times, and there were a couple of other Black merchants, but it was always the Negroes did. The Negroes entertained us at Christmas, and that was where we went down and we dedicated a Negro church. But it was like this collective, as if the Negroes didn't exist as individuals that desired a mention. And that really struck me because I read about Miss Trudy so and so got a brand new dog. But, it was Negroes, as a group. So that struck me as, well, what's happening with these Negroes? These Negroes do have names, and, they do have lives, and they are real people. But Reverend Quarterman was the only one who was mentioned. He was there at Ward Chapel for 20 years and did a lot of really good things while he was there at Ward Chapel. In 1928, they purchased land to build a parsonage. And then in 1935, again, from the money from William Corson, they built the new Ward Chapel. Now, Richard Charlton, who is the father of Miss Rose Bynum. So all of you Winter Parkers, you probably know Miss Bynum. He was her father, and he and Dexter Ray and Earl McKinney were really instrumental in building that church. When you go into the church and you look up in the ceiling, it's similar to this one, but Mr. Charlton did hand-laid the ceiling. He built the railing, and actually there was an arch in the church, which most Black churches have a huge arch, but now that was torn down when they expanded the pulpit area. But he built all of that by hand and in the church. In 61, they built the annex. And as I talked to you about the annex is a big thing in Black churches. I had to tell you how white folks that, because most white churches have annex. You build a church and you got the annex, but for Black folks, we have to have a church. So we get the church, and then later on, you build the annex. Because if you have dinner, it's either out under the trees, you go to somebody's house, you go to a restaurant. So having an annex is really a big deal. So it's usually years after the church is built that you build the annex. So as you see, it's like 35 years before the annex was built. Reverend Denmark for Ward Chapel was like one of the really big pastors there because he did a lot of renovations to the church and a lot of additions happened. During his pastorage, Ward Chapel got a steeple. And of course, Ward Chapel is the only Black church in Winter Park that has a steeple. And that distinguishes them. They had once the largest membership, about 485 people, so nearly 500 people attended Ward Chapel. This is a current view, and you see that those bare floors underneath the pews there. This archway that you can see, which almost looks like this one. Let's see, you probably can see it here in this picture. That one was the one I was telling you was built by Richard Charlton. The cross that hangs in the back is the second cross. They actually have another smaller cross when you come into the church. It's hanging right under the archway, and it was handcrafted by one of the members back in 1935. Outside they have a bell as well. And the interesting thing about these church bells is that Bethel's bell used to ring at 9 o'clock every Sunday morning to let people know it was time for Sunday school. Ward Chapel rang their bell at 11 o'clock, let you know you were already late for church. Bethel's bell is still up in the bell tower, and Ward Chapel, their bell is out in a cornerstone. This table there is their original communion table back in 1935, and it still is. When you come into the church, it's right in the back of the church, so you can see that in the church. An interesting side note, I go back to Bethel for a minute. When I was here, I think last week, we found a bell in the church. You know, Sunday school, you had this little bell, and you go ding, and the superintendent or the secretary or somebody will ring the bell and let you know it's time to start talking, and it was time for the review before the end of Sunday school. And we found one that was from 1915, and it had the names of all of the Sunday school superintendents from 1915. And so, there's lots of artifacts that I found going to the churches. There are tons of artifacts in the churches that are 75, 80, 100 years old, which I think is absolutely amazing in these churches. The next group are the Pentecostals. Now, this was really interesting for me because I didn't know a whole lot about Pentecostals. And as I was growing up, we were called the Holy Rollers, those people who make all that noise and jump around, But it was really interesting for me when I started doing research about the Pentecostals, because they are the only denomination that did not come from white churches. They started, and I know the Methodists say, we were started by black people for black people. Well, no, the Methodists came out of white churches. The Pentecostals did not. And that's all Pentecostals. That includes the white Pentecostals. They came from black churches, which I thought was absolutely amazing. The earliest church was called the Holy Church, and it started in North Carolina in 1886. There are 4 major holiness groups, and then there are 10 Pentecostal groups. And the difference between the holiness and the Pentecostal is just a little bit in their church doctrine, and then some of the holiness in their dress. They're very strict in their dress. They follow some of the biblical principles about dress, and don't wear makeup, women don't wear pants, and that kind of stuff. Whereas the Pentecostals now have moved to, you go into a Pentecostal church and you see women in slacks, and you see makeup, and you see braided hair and jewelry, and most holiness churches don't. So that's the difference. Here in Winter Park, there are 4 Pentecostal churches. 2 actually there are 5. 2 of the ones that are in the study, and these are the ones that were started before 1950. There's Flower Temple, Church of God in Christ, and then United Church of God by Faith. Now, the Church of God in Christ started in 1907, and it started by Charles Harrison Mason, and he was originally a Baptist minister, but he said in a dream, he started, God spoke to him about sanctification, and he knew that was totally different from the doctrine of the Baptist church. And so he got all fired up about it, and he started having revivals. And of course that was, the Baptists, I have to tell you, the old time Baptists were really quiet. The Methodists, they didn't say a word. You go into a Methodist church, they were just like y'all, they just sat there. And you go into a Baptist church, and you see somebody might wave their hand a little bit, they might wave their hand, they might sway a little bit, but it was still pretty quiet. But now you go to the sanctified church. I mean, you can hear that church down the road, because these people had instruments, they had drums, you wouldn't go to Baptist church and find some drums, you got to be out of your mind. So, sanctified folks had drums and sticks and washboards and tambourines, and before they had maracas, they had some peas in a jar, cans, you shake up. So the rub boards, he had that rub board going, harmonica or something. So they were live to people, whereas the other folks just kind of went to church. So, Reverend Mason came back and said, I'm fired up, I'm on fire for God, let's start having this revival. Where the Baptist said, not in here. And they kicked it out. So they just said, you go someplace else, do your own thing, but you are not going to corrupt our people and all that. So they kicked him out. And he started his own thing. So he started the Church of Christ in 1897. And he went to a revival in Los Angeles. And these people were even more on fire than he was. And so when he came back from this revival, and he was there for a couple of months, And that's how good it was. He stayed there right for a couple of months. So when he came back, he was telling people about it, and they said, no, we can't do all of that. And so again, he split, and he, in 1907, started the Church of God in Christ. And the Church of God in Christ has about 6 million members, and it is the fastest growing denomination, black denomination in America. Now, I told you that the Baptists were number one, Church of God in Christ is number two of the people. And most people don't think about Pentecostal churches. A lot of people are Pentecostal, they really think a lot of Methodists, a lot of Pentecostal. Flowers Temple was organized in 1929, again in somebody's home, Miss Fannie White's house, down on Comstock, and that house is still there on Comstock. She donated the first piece of property to the church, and they built their first church. For a long time, they were the only sanctified, as they were called then, church in Winter Park. And it was interesting, a lot of people, as I was talking about Flowers Temple, they told me Flowers Temple used to, before, air conditioning, all the churches kept their windows open. And the sanctified churches, and they still do, have long services, because the Lord comes and visits with you. So, you stay there until the Lord lets you go. And so that means you can tarry there for about 3-4 hours, So all the other black churches in Winter Park were dismissed, and then all the black folks would go down to Flowers Temple and kind of peek in the window and see what those sanctified folks were doing down there. Cliff Morey, who's their historian, told me at one time there would be probably more people outside the church than there were inside the church, because the church was filled to capacity, and he said it was all those heathens, infidels coming down here to see what was going on in the church. I thought that was pretty interesting. They started their church in a tent. When they got that piece of property from Mrs. White, they pitched a big tent, and they just had church in the tent. And they had church every single Sunday, and during the week, usually every night during the week, in the tent. And when the second minister came, they erected their first church. It was a little tin church. In 1934, they decided they were going to build a church. They were tired of a little tin church. And they heard about Mr. Carroll Ward, who had the only dairy in Winter Park. He was tearing down a house. And so the pastor and a couple of the members went down, helped him tear down the house, and they used the wood from the house to build the first church. And that church still stands. And if you want to go down, it's down on Canton. I get those Cape and Canton. It's down on Canton, and that was their first church. And actually, they used it for the dining room for a number of years. Initially, when William Corson gave from his will, Flowers Temple didn't get the money, because what they heard was that it was said by the executor that those holler and shouting people weren't really a church, so they don't get any money. It was only for churches. So the pastor of the church had to ask the district overseer, Bishop Nesbitt, to come and to speak on their behalf. And the only official document they had was the Sunday School Quarterly. So they took the Sunday School Quarterly, and Bishop Nesbitt, and they talked to the executors, and they were awarded the money as the other churches. And that's when they built their third churches, which is the same one that they're in now, still standing. And they were really excited about this church because they painted it white, because they thought it was such a triumph that they had met with some white folks and talked to them, and they said, we talked to them good, and they gave us some money. And so when they built their church, it was like a labor of love, that people started working on this church. People would come after work and, after church on Sunday and build the church. And when they got it built, they painted it white, because they said it was, and it's still white, to signify sanctification, in this church. And they're actually going through the tremendous, they're trying to raise money because they're going to double the size of the church. So when you go by, you'll see this big, like a thermometer out front of the church to signify how much money they've raised towards the building fund. Until 1960, they were just known as the Church of God in Christ. They didn't have a name. And actually, they didn't need a name because they were only, Koji in Winter Park. They changed the name to Flowers Temple because they had a pastor, Elder J.J. Flowers, who was really instrumental in building the church and doing some renovations and doing a lot for the church, and so they named it in his honor. Now, it is the only church in Winter Park that owns property on all four corners. They own all of the property on Lyman and Cape Avenues. And again, they are they've been approached, according to Pastor Reverend Lingo, Elder Lingo, by developers to purchase their property because they own, so much property on those corners. The second Pentecostal church is the Church of God by Faith. This one was interesting because it was started right here in Florida, in Jacksonville, in 1914. And it was interesting the way it got started. There was a woman who, Mrs. Scrippo, who was on had gone to revival up in Georgia. And on the train ride back home, she was so excited about what she had learned and how she had been touched in this revival that she shared her experience with everybody on the train. Well, she met two brothers, the Brights, and she was sharing with them about her experience. And they were coming back to Jacksonville. They all lived in Jacksonville. And when they got back, they got together with two other people and they started meeting in her home. And that was the beginning of the Church of God by Faith. In 1918, they built their first mission in Sweetwater, Florida, and then they became a denomination in 1923. And it's actually the smaller of the denominations. There was one here, Church of God by Faith, United Church of God by Faith. Their initial building is on the corner of Haven in Pennsylvania. It's now occupied by New Fellowship, and they're a I think they're a Church of God in Christ also. But New Fellowship is in that building. That was United's first building. So they were organized again in 1942 in the home of Miss Willie Lou Baker. And as I told you, all these churches were organized in homes, so organized in a home. They started with, there were 4 members of this church. And they just kept going. Those 4 members would get together on Sunday, they would sing and pray and have the word, and they just kept going, and people got the word out. And as my pastor says, each one bring one, and each one brought one, and they just built a really nice church. The first pastor for the church pitched a tent, and that's pretty common in holiness and Pentecostal. They pitch a tent. So he pitched a tent on the corner of Canton, Pennsylvania, and they were in that tent for quite a while. And then people would come by, and when I was talking with some of the members, they said he pitched a tent there purposely, and they didn't build a church because they wanted people to hear the Word of God. And they thought, no matter what was going on, and of course over on Pennsylvania, there used to be a couple of juke joints. And they said sometimes the music from the juke was getting a little too loud for them. So, they had to get the rubber going, they got the tambourine going. So there was a little louder than the juke joint. So the people would come out of the juke joint and come on across the street and hear the Word of God. So in 1950, they built the church, and of course the New Fellowship is in that church. And it's a neat little church if you have an opportunity to go and see that church. Their current pastor, Elder Green, took over the church in 1966. And he said there were about 20 to 25 members when he took over the church. Now they have a little more than 150, and they built a new church in 79 on Simons. And actually, they started some renovation, and they built a fellowship hall. Now, from 1979 to 2004, here's an annex, y'all. They built it took them that long to get the money. They built the annex and actually a fellowship hall for the youth. This church has, you see this picture of the pews, these are hand carved. And when I first went into the church, I thought, oh, this is so beautiful. They're doing some renovations. And this picture actually doesn't do them justice. And Elder Green told me, oh, well, we're going to renovate. And I said, well, what are you going to do with these beautiful pews? And, he said, well, we'll probably get some new pews and all that. And so, I went back to the library and I said, whoa, they have these beautiful pews, And apparently, since there was so much interest in these pews, they decided to keep them. Because, it was like, well, they thought, well, who wants these old pews? They've been here since, 1979, who wants these old things? And I think, well, they're absolutely, I was so struck when I went into there, that these pews are absolutely beautiful. So they're going to keep them. So, Dean, you don't get one for the library. I always said, oh, let me call all these people, they want a pew, and I'm glad they decided to keep those pews and then just maybe put some new padding on the pews. This church is interesting because they provide a lot of social programs. And most black churches provide social programs, but this one has like a whole ministry of things. They have a women's ministry, a shut-in ministry. They have a van that picks up the elderly and the disabled. They also have their own preschool program, and they have an after-school program. They have a for drug and substance abuse program for single mothers, something to do with pregnant youth. So they have, all kinds of social programs that they have going on in their church. As an aside, most black churches probably provide more social programs than any social service agency in the United States. Because you go, when you're sick, you call a pastor. And the pastor calls somebody and help you out. When your house burns down, you need some money, you go to the church. Your church is the first place you go instead of going someplace else. So black churches provide, lots of social and lots of counseling. And I can say, as myself, I told you, I'm a preacher's kid, that when my dad was a pastor and people got in trouble, they call my dad. My mom get out of bed in the middle of the night and serve some coffee and some pie. And the people would come to our house. We need some prayer, we need some counseling. This happened, this happened. So much so that people forgot my father's name and just called him Red. But it was so, it's the black church is really more than a church. It is a social agency as well. And so, United has really a lot of programs that they're doing there. So final notes. As I talk to members and pastors and people about this whole project, Winter Park, the black churches in Winter Park really have a proud heritage and strong family ties, because there are people who are Winter Parkers who've been here their whole lives, who've been in churches their whole lives. Their mother, their father, their grandparents were members of the churches. And I found that, very interesting. And you don't find that. You think of metropolitan, cosmopolitan kind of areas. You don't find that people stay in churches. There's so much movement. But I found a really proud heritage in their churches. A lot of the congregations worry about gentrification. They look out at what's happening next door, across the street. Developers are knocking on their doors, wanting their property. And a lot of them are really worried that they're going to be forced out, that maybe the city will do something that will force them out of their property. And so they're worried about, losing, what they have. The thing I think that struck me the most, and I talked to you a little bit before about it, was that these voices of all these black people who attended all these churches and still attend churches are missing from Winter Park history. And I think that's so sad that, not even a mention of, these voices. And so, I'm really honored that these people in these churches, which are like my family now, have entrusted me to maybe tell their story and giving me, help them find their voice. So hopefully from this venture, these voices won't be lost. I found lots of oral history, and it was really interesting. Every time I went to a church, somebody would say, well, see Miss So-and-so. Or go down to the nursing home. And I've been down to the Married to People nursing home, I'm going to tell you. I even know the code now, because I've been in there so many times. And I would go to church and somebody would say, oh, you got to see my aunt or my grandma. And I'll say, okay. And she's down in the nursing home. Or she lives over on Kent. And I'm thinking, okay, what's the house number? And they would say, well, you go over there by Miss So-and-so's house. She lives too down, thinking, where is that? So I kind of fumbled my way through it. I have to admit, people in Winter Park are kind of hospitable. I would just go and knock on somebody's door, and they say, oh, no, honey, she's down here. And they would come out and show me, and I would ring people's doorbell and go in, and they don't know me from Eve. And I would go in and sit down, and I use poor Miss Swain's name in vain. I'd say, do you have pictures? And they would say, yes. And I said, Miss Swain, let me take her pictures home. And I took them home, and I scanned them, gave them back to her on the disc and the CD. She was real happy. I promised I'll bring them back, I said, at night I gave my first child, so I used Miss Swain, and so people said, oh yeah, I know Miss Swain. And so people were really generous, and they gave me their pictures, and they let me in their houses, and I said that was nothing but a blessing from God, because I knew none of these people. before I started this. And I met so many people, you know, and of course I drank a lot of Kool-Aid too, but I sat and talked with a lot of people, and, you know, lots of Sundays, my pastors and dad passed the council right then. For about 2 months, I didn't go to my church, because I went to all of these churches, and I said, Pastor, now, you know, I can't come to church this Sunday, because I'm going to some of these other churches, and she just said, remember where home is now, you know. I said, okay, so about 2 months, I went to all these churches, and after church, I come home about 6 o'clock, and I'd be whipped. And my mom would say, what happened to you, baby? And I said, well, Mom, you know, I went to this house, and I went here, and I had to go there. But this was an interesting process for me. It really, I think, grounded me again in what it means to be a black person in a black church. That how important that history is. And I know there's this whole talk about churches being segregated, and that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. But, you know, the black church is really an important part of history in any community. And I think what's happening, especially in Winter Park, because I was saddened that I didn't find a lot of pictures. And I heard over and over again, except Miss Wayne. Miss Wayne had about 1,000 of them. So he had all those pictures. When I first came, I thought, good God, how many pictures he had. You know, we went through all those boxes, but most of the other churches didn't have very many pictures. And I heard a lot of people say, well, you know, we don't take pictures. And so I said, you know, you should start taking pictures. And a lot of places, you know, I took pictures, and I said, I'm going to share these pictures with you. I'll give you copies of these pictures, so you at least have the pictures that I've taken, and hopefully this will encourage you to start taking pictures and start writing stuff down. But a lot of it is in the head, somebody's head. And a lot of people will say, well, let me look at this picture. Well, Reverend so-and-so was the pastor, so this was about, you know, this time. And so there was a lot of oral history, not a lot written down. And my whole thought in this is to help churches write it down. When I first started this project, when I actually wrote the proposal, and actually before then I had found a model at Vanderbilt University, and it was the model to preserve black church history. And when I saw that model, a lot of it was like 4 steps, that you talk to the historian, somebody in the church, and you get their stories, and you help them to write it down, and then you help them to publish it. And so I thought, okay, this is, you know, what I want to do. And in the process of doing this, I followed the steps. I talked to, 3 days ago, Friday, whatever, how many days ago was that? Okay, whatever it was, Friday. I talked to Dr. Harris, who is at Vanderbilt, and he was called Forrest Harris, like Forrest Harris. And he talked to me about this project. He said, so how's it going down there in Florida? And so he was like, we talked for about 2 hours, and he was like really surprised, and he said, wow, you know, you got to come to Vanderbilt, you know. And so I told him that from this project, I've had so many people say to me, well, when are you coming to Sanford? You know, what you gonna do for Midway? You know, what about Altamont? You know, when you coming to Orlando? So my friend Ruth said, this is a series, you know, this is the first in the series. So, you know, I think this probably will be the first in the series to help people, to, you know, to write down the history and, you know, get all that stuff out of their head, and those 90-year-old women, you know, those 90-year-old men, you know, write it all down and pass it down. So that the younger people in the church, you know, are as ecstatic and as proud about the church history and know as much, you know, as the elders in the church. So for me, there's still a whole lot of work to do in this area. And, you know, if the Lord blesses me, I'm going to continue to do this. This is just, you know, a little tip of, you know, what there is out there to find. And again, I'm really honored. I really want to acknowledge the committee again and say thank you for selecting this project as a Smith Award for this year. And thank you to all the churches and all the people who are here who let me your pictures, let me into your house, shared your stories with me, you know, and allowed me to tell your stories. I'm really honored that that happened. Questions? I'm ready to take some questions now that I've babbled on. For stuff, well, let me tell you one thing. I am still seeking photographs. So if you have photographs in your shoe boxes in some place, in your closet, your grandma had some, have old documents, let me know. Also, oral histories, you know, if they want me to come and talk to you. Now, I like to talk. So y'all see how I want to talk? I like to talk. I'll come talk to you, and I'll listen to you, and I'll write stuff down. You know, wherever I go, I have my notebook. The other day, I was talking to Miss Wayne. We were at Dexter's having lunch. And she started talking. I said, wait, let me get the notebook out so I can write this down. So, I'll talk to you. And any of you have information about Grand Chapel or Pappas Chapel or New Warner Chapel, let me know. Because I want to include them in the second phase of this whole thing. So I'm still, seeking information. Questions? What questions do you have? I'll try to answer any that you have. I should keep this. Okay, now talk to me, y'all. Okay, Reverend Young.
First I want
Need the microphone?
Yes.
I feel like Oprah.
If I could make a brief statement before I ask my question.
Sure, go right ahead. It's your church, you home.
Praise God. But you are Madam President tonight. First, I want to thank God for you for sharing information that you've given and imparted into us about the black church, because the black church is the center of any community. And also, Dr. Forrest Harris was my supervisor at Vanderbilt. So I knew he was a wonderful person. I just praise God for you even the more. But the question I want to ask, how long did it take for you to compile this information, to come to such bold points?
Oh, I got 1 minute more. And my line bill on that picture. Oh, I got to turn it on. And I can't see that this way. Line in the line, huh? I actually started this project in July. I actually started thinking about it before July. Because I said I go to church here in Winter Park and I come through every Sunday. And so probably last October before last, I started thinking about it. And it just, like I said, God put this on my heart. Because every Sunday I would come and I would see something new. And I think, okay, where'd that come from? What's happening? And then, the closing of Grand Chapel just really, tore up my heart. And I think, okay, is that going to happen to everybody else? And where's the history? And so officially with the library, I started in July in this process. And July has been fast motion ever since, and after I got started here in Bethel, I thought, okay, where am I going to start? And somebody said, see Miss Swain. Actually, I called you and you said, see Miss Swain. And so I started here in Bethel in July, and just after that, just going places, and people call me up, or I meet somebody and say, hey, I'm doing this, and then people start saying, oh, you're that lady. And actually when I started going to the churches, I met with all the pastors, and then I would go to the churches, and they would all say, oh, there's a lady back there, and I waved my hand. It was so interesting. I was in Flowers Temple. And I sat in the back, and I said, I got up and introduced myself, and I said, after church, if you have something, you can, see me after church. I had about 10 people, come to the back, start talking to me, and I said, now, we got to go outside, here's the pastor up here preaching his heart out, y'all back here getting some history, let's come outside, So, but since July, so it's been, it's been kind of condensed, and, so there's a whole lot more. But a lot of it's just digging, and there's so many interesting things to find, too. I've been really trying to go back and find, one of the things I was interested in, because there was a lot of kind of lore in Winter Park, that all of the churches got property from the Winter Park Land Company. And that's been written into the documents as if it's history. So I started searching through some of the records. My sister-in-law's an attorney, and she's a real estate attorney. So I went to her office and said, okay, help me dig through this stuff. And so we went through a lot of old records and looking at property records. And what I discovered was that's not true. The Winter Park Land Company did not give all the property to churches, although people believe that it's gospel that happened. And a lot of it was property that black people owned that they gave to the church, like that $1 one. A lot of it was property that was given to people, and all of it was property that was bought by people in the churches. So it was, so that's where I started, just kind of figuring out, kind of going backwards, trying to kind of unravel all this history, because it's really, this Winter Park lore, I call it, is really interesting, and especially about Hannibal Square and about, how it was owned and when it came to be. So, I was kind of a little detective and an amateur historian trying to find out, what I could find. And so there's still so much to unravel, and I have to go back, they got tired of me in the property appraiser's office, and I'm still looking for, I met an architect, black architect, and he told me that as I go in these churches, most of them have the same kind of design. And so he was telling me if I find the old plans, I'll find the name of the architect. So I'm still searching, but it takes me all day to go in there. I had to sneak my water and sandwich in there, to the archives, but I'm still gonna keep digging. Even though the project's officially over, I'm gonna keep digging, and find what I can. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Would you do this in a book form Would you do this in a book form?
I did, for the library, I started in, it's like, so we have like a first edition, there it is, a first edition, and since I've done that, I found more information, so that's really, obsolete now, so I got another one now. And so as I find more information, I put it in. So actually what I decided to do was, I will put it in, actually this part is in book form, and I'm just going to keep adding to it until I find it. Now eventually going to stop. I said that, I set this date in my mind that at the end of March, I'm going to stop right there. And that will be the second edition. And then I'll collect more stuff, and then maybe towards the end of the year, to maybe a third edition. Because every day, I get more and more information. And a couple of the churches who originally didn't participate, now said they'd like to. So, and I eventually want to include all the black churches in one park.
So it was just like it'd be a series that you would be putting together.
Yeah, like I said, when I finish Winter Park, I want to go to another community because I think it's really important to preserve this history. So.
I think you started off real good.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
You mentioned that there was no history of the black churches or the blacks at all in the Winter Park information that you. So why was there no history, and how do we go about getting our history so our children after us will be able to go to the library or go to the university and research it?
Well, now you want my real answer to why there's no history? Because black people didn't matter. That's a real answer. Black people didn't matter. Why would you write about black people in 18, this is like right, I can remember, this is right after the Emancipation Proclamation. And before then, black people had been slaves, had been property, had been chattel. And now black people were free. And so why would white people write about black people? They didn't have a purpose to write about black people, so they didn't. And then we didn't write about ourselves, because, you go through this process of coming from slavery into emancipation, and then trying to find some sense, of yourself, and how do it's tough going from being a slave and somebody telling you what to get up, what to do, and everything, and having total control over your family, and now you finally have control over yourself, and it's just developing that sense of self and persevering going forth. And so we didn't write down our own history. I'm finding now that more and more people are writing down their history, which I think is really, really important, that you write down your history. And not only did you write it down, that you tell somebody else about it. When I talked to Dr. Harris, every time I talked to him, we had like these 2 or 3 hour conversations. We talked about, one of the things we talked about was collecting black church history and collecting history. And he was saying that the traditional black churches are really dying out because young people have no connection with traditional black churches. And so that's why they're flocking to the mega churches. And a part of it is because in the 60s, and especially in the 60s, the civil rights movement, the church was like the center, the black church was the center of the civil rights movement. And so people got all pumped up about going to church. Even if you didn't go on Sunday, you were there for some meeting during the week, to hear, Reverend Martin Luther King or somebody else talk about something, in the church. And so you had a common purpose. Well, after the civil rights movement was over, and we moved into the 70s and the 80s, there was no movement. And so a lot of people moved away from the church because they were kind of disillusioned. And so we have this whole generation, our Generation Xers, who have no connection to civil rights movement, to black churches. And so some of them are now starting to look for spiritualism, and so they flock to the mega churches because, you know, a lot of mega churches is a place where there are lots of young people, lots of energy, and so they're not connected to their history. So I think it's our job to now get our young people to see the importance of history. You know, I was talking this way, we're at Dexter's, and she was telling me that a lot of people, they have old things in their church, and they think, well, that's old. You know, I don't want that, I want something new, and they toss it out. And so with it, they toss out the history as well. And so we have to get people to stop doing that. Yes, sir. So you can start doing some history in Winter Park, okay? That's my challenge to you.
Rebecca, I'm going to make my staff really nervous.
Okay, go ahead, go ahead.
I'm going to pledge two things tonight.
Okay.
One is that anybody in this room, or anybody that you know in this room, is welcome to bring in any family histories, photos, diaries, anything that you have, and we'll preserve it at the library for you.
Amen.
Our archivist is here, Dean. You can see Dean, you can see Ruth, or you can see me. The other thing, Ruth, is that I think that it's time for the Institute to do a class on how to write church histories, and perhaps Rebecca would teach that for us.
I will. I'd be glad to, Bob. Anybody else? Take your stuff to the library. Y'all pull that stuff out. I know you got stuff in those hat boxes, you know, in drawers and trunks, under the bed, you know, under grandma's quilts, you know. Yeah, now listen, if you take it to the library, they'll scan it and you'll get it back. Nobody's gonna keep it, okay? Miss Wayne trusted me, so, you know. Hey, Reverend Hall.
God bless you.
You too. Now, Reverend Hall was one of those guys I just went to his house and knocked on his door and he said, come on in, honey. Just like he knew me forever, you know?
Well, I'm sorry, but
That's okay.
I just don't remember you.
That's okay.
But I thank God that I've been here in Winter Park most of my life. I came here from the state of Mississippi, and I came here a black man. And all during my life, I've been black. I was a member of the Ministerial Alliance when the white man said they were going to be with us. And we would go over to the white churches and minister that, I forget his name now, and I was the only black preacher. And they would let Brother Bell and they give us 30 minutes, but they give him 15 minutes and me 15 minutes. But when they come to our church, they have one of their preachers would preach the whole sermon. And I said to the preacher one day, why are you making a difference between us and you? You do us one way and you do the other. And I'm getting out from among you because you are treating us one way because we are black. I'm 89 years old. And I've been black all my life. I came from the state of Mississippi. And I thank God for Winter Park. I've been living here for a long time. They have one commercial building, and there's two commercial buildings in Winter Park that's named after black women. And thank God one of them is my daughter. I thank God for standing here tonight. And I can say that I know I don't have long to be here among the living. Because when I was a young man, I was a funeral director. And I know when you leave here, you're not going to take nothing with you. And that's the reason why I'm not trying to save up nothing, because I'm not going to carry nothing with me. But I just want to say to you, madam, I have one of the smallest congregations in Winter Park, and it's called Prayer Mission Church of God in Christ. We are there every Sunday. I have a group that comes all the way from Apopka to worship in this service. And I want to invite you. Evidently, you don't know where it is, but
Yes, I do.
try to find it. Come see us. The only reason why I'm satisfied with the small group, Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are assembled, I will be in the midst. And it's more than 2 or 3 of us down here. So he's there. And as long as Jesus is there, God bless. And I just want to say I thank God for you. And I just thought I'd stand and let you know that I'm here. And you're invited down to prayer mission to see how we do and what we're doing. And all of you that listen to me today, you are invited to prayer mission. God bless you.
Now, Reverend Hall, I'll be down to prayer mission, but I'm a liturgist at my church this month, so, you know, it's got to be next month. I don't think the pastor would appreciate me not coming next month. But as soon as I have a responsibility at church, I'm coming to prayer mission. Get back on. Okay? Yes, sir.
Well, we unlocked the church. It's going to be locked up. You can come in and get ready.
Okay. All right, I will.
Reverend Hall mentioned there were 2 institutions in Nepal who had been named for African Americans, and one of them is Mary Lee DePue. The Mary Lee DePue Nursing Home on Sunday afternoon at 3:30 will dedicate the new renovations for the nursing home, and you're cordially invited. It's a new renovation of over $2.5 million. And you might be interested to know that Mrs. Mary Lee DePue was a member of the Ward Chapel Methodist Church and started the Ideal Woman's Club, which she did in 1937 to encourage community pride among African Americans on what they called in the west side of Nepal. And out of the Ideal Woman's Club, a lady by the name of Mrs. Cheney, Laughlin, organized the Benevolent Club. And she started raising funds to be able to pay for patients who did not have money for medical care in Nepal. And therefore, out of that group, through sewing bees and dinners, they organized a medical clinic, this is back during the legal segregation, for a medical clinic on the corner of Moss Boulevard and Pennsylvania. And the black physicians from Orlando came to Winter Park at least once a week for a free clinic at the medical clinic. Then it was converted, and this is the Benevolent Club. We had a challenge to raise the money for a nursing home. And it was the Ideal Woman's Club who donated the property on the initial corner there of Pennsylvania and Morse Boulevard for the nursing home, which is now a 40-bed institution. It was the first chartered institution in the state of Florida, which was dedicated at that time only for blacks in the state of Florida for nursing charter licensing. And so I just mentioned that you're invited to this opening on this Sunday afternoon, in which members of the congregation of various churches will be providing music for the occasion.
Thank you. Any other questions? Good. We have Ms. Wayne. Oh, yes,
I
sir.
have just one fast one now.
Okay.
Did we figure out that? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just trying to determine how many black churches there actually are here. Have we done that?
In Winter Park, there are about 12 churches. There are a couple of really small, like Reverend Hall's church, and then Reverend Freeze has another smaller congregation. The largest was actually is Baptist. But about 12.
Okay, thanks.
How big is the Seventh Day Adventist Church?
I don't know exactly how many members they have, but I was talking to one of the members, and she knows that there's 1 to 400. So it's the largest. And then the second largest, I think, is Bethel.
status of Grand Chapel?
Closed.
Is the congregation still?
So I understand the congregation kind of dispersed and they've gone to, there's like, they're shaking her head, no, what happened?
Oh, no, I wasn't shaking my head.
No, there's one lady that's shaking her head right behind you there.
Grand Chapel is no more, not having service anymore, it's always closed. And I can hear it soon,
Oh,
because of the new vision there about 15 years.
okay.
And I was there until they closed it out.
So I need to talk to you. Hey. All right. Yeah, that's right. Get that Kool-Aid ready. You know, it's interesting. Every time I meet a black person in Winter Park, I say, "What church you go to?" You know, that's the first thing I say to them when I go. This one lady I said to the other day, she said, "Well," you know, and I said, "Well, don't tell me you don't go to church. Which church did you go to when you went?" You know? I said, "I'm not the church police. I'm just trying to get." So she kind of hesitated. She finally told me that she went to a New Hope. And I said, "Okay, I need to talk to you." So I gave her my card. And I said, "Give me your phone number. I'm going to call you." You know, she was still a little hesitant, but she gave it to me. So I need to talk to you. Tell her about Grand Chapel.
Well, I have a lot of history of New Hope Baptist too.
Oh, I really need to talk to you. I'll bring the Kool-Aid. Yes, sir.
I just want to say that I enjoyed the presentation, and
Thank you.
I want to apologize that I'm from Mount Moriah.
Okay.
And when I didn't get a chance to talk with you as much as I should have, the time you called me, I was in hospital with surgery, you
Remember
remember.
that, Rebekah?
But that was a lot of things you left out of Mount Moriah that I was
I know you're going to tell me. I want 2 glasses of Kool-Aid when I come here.
Dr. McCloud, I'm a member of the Smith Committee and have been involved in it for over 10 years. And we've had presentations each of those years. This is by far not only the largest audience we've had, but it really is the finest expression of everything that committee has set out to do. I think I know I speak for all of us in saying how grateful we are to you for what you've done for all of us.
I have a comment.
Okay.
As a black woman, I am just so inspired when I'm reminded of how soon after emancipation, black people got together, pooled their resources, and built churches, built congregations. It's just so inspiring for me to be reminded of that, and it's such a motivation for me to take steps and do some of the things that I want to accomplish in my own life. I mean, we're talking shortly after emancipation that black people built, created, came together, did these works together, collaborated. It's inspiring for me, and thank you for sharing this with us.
You're welcome. I was inspired by that too, because I think people forget what a short time ago that was. You know, that one of the things I wrote about, this young lady asked me about the book, one of the things I did write about was like the history of the black church. For a long time it was called the invisible institution because black people didn't have their own churches, so they would go out into the fields at night, you know, to get together for churches. I ran across, in North Carolina, there was a law that banned black people from meeting. More than 2 black people couldn't meet together. They couldn't read the Bible, they couldn't sing. Even in the presence of a white person, they could not have church. And so a lot of people would, you know, steal away and go out to the woods and just have a prayer, you know. And of course, an interesting thing, as an aside, in black churches, when black people didn't have hymnals, you know, they would get an old battered hymnal from a white church, and one person would have a hymnal. And so in Baptist churches, they call it a line in the hymn. And so the one person who could read and the one person with the hymnal would say, okay, this is in common meter. So, you know, if you're a black Baptist, you know what that tune sounds like. Because they always sound the same, no matter what, you know. Yeah, Lord, yeah. And so the person
read out the words, and then you would sing, a stanza there. And then he'd read out, and it was always a hymn. He'd read out the foreword, and then you would all sing. Now, it would take you 20 minutes to sing one hymn, but you got it, and every Sunday you would sing the same hymn, until about a month or two you got that one, then you move on to a new one.
And that included the moaning after.
Oh, yeah. That was a part of it too. And you had to moan in tune. If you couldn't moan in tune, you just had to be quiet. That was it.
One part of that in our church was, then Mr. Ernest Hill would say, well, some sister or some brother, please pray.
Oh, yeah.
And I always prayed before the person prayed that it wouldn't be my grandmother, because I knew it would extend the service by at least 20 minutes.
We had a joke. We used to say, you can tell those men who don't talk at home, the wife doing all the talking, because when they get up to talk in church, they die. They would carry on, and my father had one little deacon who would get up and we would say, actually he became Reverend Baker. He was a youth minister. We said, oh Lord, please don't let Reverend Baker pray. Because that man would stand up and he would bless everybody by name. And I would say, now God knows our name. He knows everybody in here. You don't have to name us by name, And as kids we would say, oh no, I'm not Reverend Baker. But you're right. It was really interesting. Yeah, right after emancipation, that I think people were so filled with jubilee to be free that the church was this natural expression. And in a lot of communities, the first thing that was built was the church. The people, and that happened in Winter Park, that these churches were constructed by people in the community. And people would go across the tracks, and they were working homes and the railroads and whatnot in the daytime, and come back at night and build the churches. I talked to Mrs. Doherty, one of those ladies who she probably won't remember me again. She's in the nursing home. And when I came in, she said, hey, baby. And I'm thinking, you don't know me, But she just talked to me and she told me about coming here to Winter Park and how her husband, worked over across the tracks. And they always call across the tracks. Go across the tracks in the daytime, and at night they would come and she had a KFC lamp and some sandwiches or some fried chicken or something, and then the men would come and they would build the church at night until they were too tired to work anymore. And then they would go home and go to bed and get up and go back across the tracks in the morning. And that's how these churches were built. And then people in the community, people who didn't even go to church, would say, okay, they're building the church down there, let me go down there, bring my hammer, bring some nails, I'll help you out. And so that's how all this was done, just by the labor of the people in this community. So when you look at the work, and a lot of these people were not people who were trained. They didn't go to school. They were, craftsmen who did all of the work in these churches. And I think it's just, when I look at some of the stuff that has been, tossed out of churches, that really breaks my heart, because, it's so much work. You look at this and you think, somebody in the early 1900s built this. They didn't have, a machine. They built this. Hammers and nails, like kerosene lamp, they built this. And so, just the buildings themselves, history. So when you tear them down, you tear down so much. And that, like I say, when I would go by and say, this can't happen. These places have to stay. They have to. Yes, ma'am.
One of the outgrowths of the black church, the innovativeness of blacks to move forward to start the first schools for blacks in their local communities. And many of those teachers that came from the black church and starting the black schools, they could go to the 8th grade, take the test, and then if they passed that test, they could teach. And one such person of that era was born in 1885, and that was my mother. Another organizations, when the black child could not go to the libraries and all these other places, then there became an organization that started with 21 ladies in Philadelphia called Jack and Jill of American Inc. many years after the beginning of the black church. And these people, because their children couldn't go to the skating rinks and all the other organizations that they had for the white child, they didn't. And these mothers got together and they started this organization that's known as Jack and Jill America Inc. And so many activities came out of that. And it started as an organization in 1938, but it was due to the only arena that they had for so long was the black church. And the history of Jack and Jill of America Inc. I'm the National Archivist and the premier author of the history book, along with 2 co-authors on Jack and Jill, and the things that these people, the innovativeness that they had to get some of the same activities and so forth for their children. And now there are organizations all over the United States and 2 in Africa of Jack and Jill. But it's the innovativeness and what you want and what you would like to do. You may not have had the advanced education back there, but you had common sense and you wanted to move forward for the best for your children.
Okay, now when I come to your house, you look like you can make a mean pound cake, so I don't want it too big, I want some cake. Yeah, I want some cake when I come to your house. I want some pound cake, you know. I want the fat kind that got all that butter in it. And I don't want the low fat stuff.
I guess I'm standing to conclude our session this afternoon to express our appreciation to you for the tremendous amount of work you have done, for the interesting way you have presented this tonight, for the perseverance that you have continued to have as you move forward with the project. And just to say to you, thank you so very much for sharing. I'm not one of the persons who was born in Orange County, but I've been a transplant here now for 30-some years. And I grew tremendously tonight in the awareness of who black churches are and what we stand for. And so we applaud you in your efforts and wish you Godspeed as you move from here to where God would have you go with these projects. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
In concluding this evening, we invite you to join us in the annex for punch and cookies and also some personal time with the author. She'll be back there. There are 2 copies of her book that are over here from the final project that was turned into the libraries that are right here in this room. And as you go through, if you did not get a chance to sign her guest book as you came in, it is over here in this anteroom on the way to the annex. And the order form is on the back of this program that you received if you'd like to request a copy of the book. Thank you.